we're going to be talking about gymnosperms and the gymnosperm life cycle. And gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants. They produce cones, which are the reproductive structure, and on the surface of the scales of the cones, the seeds are actually produced. Now, gymnosperm, let's go ahead and write that down. Gymnosperms actually means naked seed. Gymno means naked, and sperm means seed. So these produce naked seeds, seeds that are not surrounded by a fruit, like the angiosperms are, or the flowering plants. They're surrounded by a fruit. Gymnosperms aren't like that. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the life cycle of a gymnosperm. And I like to start with the dominant stage on top. That's the most obvious stage. So if you went out and you looked at a pine tree, which is an example of a gymnosperm, what you're actually looking at is the sporophyte stage. So let's go ahead and write sporophyte on top. And the sporophyte is going to be 2N. It's diploid. It has 2 of each type of chromosome. And I'm going to make a little note up here that this is the dominant stage. And because gymnosperms undergo an alternation of generations like all other plants, we not only have the sporophyte stage, but we also have the gametophyte stage. And we have a male and a female gametophyte. So let's go ahead and write those down. So I'm going to write female gametophyte. And that's going to be haploid. And the male gametophyte. Also haploid. And another name for the male gametophyte is the pollen grain. What is a pollen grain? A pollen grain is essentially a protein container. And inside this protein container are going to be 2 sperm. And they're non-flagellated sperm. Most sperm have flagella so they can swim through water. But in this case, we don't need the flagella because the sperm are going to travel inside the protein container to wherever they need to go. So nature, or through evolution, the flagella was discarded. It was gotten rid of. So these are non-flagellated sperm. Now the sporophyte is going to produce spores. So I'm going to go ahead and write spores down. And spores are going to be haploid. And we're actually going to produce 2 types of spores. We're going to produce a large spore called a megaspore and a small spore called a microspore. And our gametophyte is going to produce gametes, sperm and egg. So let's go ahead and put our gametes over here. Sperm and egg. Now let's go ahead, we're going to connect up the various parts of our life cycle. So the sporophyte is going to produce spores, a megaspore and a microspore. So I'm going to draw an arrow to each one of those. Now because the spores are 2 different sizes, that's going to be referred to as heterospory. So heterospory, and hetero means different. So the spores look different from each other. Phenotypically, they are different. And also because we're going from 2N to N, that we have to go through the process called meiosis. And meiosis is a form of sexual reproduction. So whenever we use meiosis, we're going to get genetically different cells. So the megaspores are going to be genetically different from each other. The microspores are going to be genetically different from each other. And that's going to create variation. So very, very important process. Now the megaspore actually forms on a structure called the female cone. The female cone is also known as the ovulate cone. And the megaspore is going to form on the scales of the ovulate cone. And the microspores are going to form on the male cone. also known as the pollen cone. Okay, the pollen cones are also very much smaller compared to the ovulate cones. And if you have allergies, this is what you're allergic to. You're allergic to the pollen that will ultimately be produced by that pollen cone. All right. Now, the megaspore eventually is going to continue to develop, and it's going to turn into the female gametophyte. So we're going to draw an arrow down here. Same thing goes for the microspore. It's going to continue to develop into finally a male gametophyte. And we are going from N to N, so this process is going to take place by mitosis. And also, it's worth saying that unlike the mosses and the ferns, which release their spores into the air, these spores are going to stay put right on the scales. They're not going to leave. So let's go ahead and make a note of that. Spores remain on cones. Now we're at our gametophyte. And the gametophyte is going to go ahead and produce gametes. So our female gametophyte is going to produce an egg. And the male gametophyte is going to produce sperm. Okay, and again, non-flagellated sperm, because we don't need them. We don't need the flagella because we're going to ride inside a pollen grain. Now we're going from N to N. So again, this process that creates this is going to be mitosis. Now we're up at the level of gametes, sperm and egg. And the sperm and egg are going to get together. And of course we want the sperm from a genetically different plant to get together with an egg from another plant. Again, that creates more genetic variation. So I'm going to have these two come together and ultimately produce a sporophyte. So the egg and the sperm are going to come together through the process of fertilization. And this is actually going to be what we call single fertilization. All right? And it's going to be called single fertilization because one sperm fertilizes the egg. So sperm N, egg N, and that's going to give us our embryo, which is going to be 2N. Our embryo is ultimately going to be our sporophyte. And the other sperm dies. So it's kind of a winner-take-all situation here. Again, each pollen grain is going to contain two sperm. One sperm is going to fertilize the egg and ultimately become our embryo, which is going to grow into our sporophyte, and the other sperm is going to die. All right? So N plus N, 2N, that gives us our sporophyte. And that's going to be it for the gymnosperm life cycle.